Bien, mais on va pouvoir commencer. Merci beaucoup d'être venu à cette nouvelle séance du séminaire IDEE trimestrielle. Et donc, comme vous le savez, aujourd'hui, on a décidé de prendre pour thème la question des mesures de long terme. C'est évidemment une question hyper importante en éducation, d'avoir des effets à long terme, mais on sait tous que c'est très compliqué. D'abord, il ne faut pas être trop pressé de publier, et puis ensuite, il faut produire des données de bonne qualité sur le long terme, avec pas trop d'attrition, et donc ce sont des problèmes évidemment extrêmement complexes. Et donc on avait envie de réfléchir à ça aujourd'hui, en ayant un certain nombre d'exemples, et en fait avec un peu deux catégories de stratégies. La stratégie qui consiste à utiliser des données administratives et à les apparier avec les données expérimentales, et donc c'est cette stratégie qui va être présentée avec par les deux papiers, par les deux intervenants de ce matin, Clément et Yann, que je remercie beaucoup de nous faire l'amitié de venir. Et puis cet après-midi, Pascaline va nous montrer plutôt l'autre stratégie, qui consiste à faire des enquêtes dans la durée. C'est évidemment un truc totalement fou. Et donc Pascaline va cet après-midi nous raconter comment ils y sont arrivés, plutôt arrivés, j'ai l'impression quand même, hein, et discuter un peu à la fois les résultats et puis les méthodes. Et évidemment, l'enjeu aussi, c'est de voir dans quelle mesure, quand on fait ça, on change la perspective sur l'intervention, le jugement qu'on a sur l'intervention par rapport à ce qu'on a envie de dire si on s'arrête à la fin de l'année où on a mis en œuvre l'expérimentation. Donc évidemment, c'est toutes ces questions qu'on a envie d'illustrer et de discuter avec vous aujourd'hui. Voilà, et je donne la place à Clément pour commencer. Merci.
Bon, merci beaucoup pour l'invitation, je suis très content d'être là. Donc Marc a raison, il ne faut pas être trop pressé pour publier quand on fait ce genre de projet, parce qu'en fait ce projet on l'a commencé en 2009, j'étais je pense encore en M2, donc heureusement, donc ça a quand même donné lieu déjà à une publication, mais heureusement que quand on attend que les résultats d'une expé progressent, on peut faire un peu des papiers d'économétrie, parce que sinon j'aurais été un peu embêté pour publier. Et donc je vais vous présenter aujourd'hui les effets de long terme de cette expérimentation. And I'm going to switch to English, actually that's going to be easier. So a bit of, I'm going to start by giving you a lot of background for the very specific conditions under which the intervention we're going to be looking at emerged, because I think it's important to understand that, to understand the nature of the intervention. So first, a bit of general background about France. So now we know, it's kind of recent actually, but there is this recent GPUB paper by actually a PhD student from PSC and a PhD student from Sciences Po that came with a bit of bad news as to perhaps nobody ever believed in the French dream, but for those who did believe in that French dream, that paper was a bit disappointing because they computed reliably for the first time the rank-rank correlation between fathers and sons' income in the national distribution. And I say reliably because they did not only use self-reported income data, which we know is very unreliable when you do this type of exercises. They relied on fiscal data for the first time. And there are only 11 countries for which the same rank-rank correlation has been measured reliably using fiscal data. And France is actually number 2 in terms of how low social mobility is. Actually, we're still a bit better than the US. So, you know, like speaking of American dream, well, actually the French dream is a little bit better than the American one, but very marginally. And so, of course, France is much worse than Scandinavia, but that's not news. We knew that ex ante. What's more surprising is that France is much worse than Canada, Italy, Australia, Spain, even Italy, actually. You know, like you would have thought that, but no, actually, France is much worse than Italy on that dimension. So there seems to be another team of PhD students did a fantastic, very important descriptive job showing that they looked at a different socioeconomic gradient, which is socioeconomic gradient in access to higher education. And there as well, they found a very large gap. So the students whose parents belong to the top decile of the income distribution have, if I'm remembering correctly, 90% chances of at least starting some higher education. When you look at the bottom decile, it's 30%. And this gradient is actually comparable to what you observe in the US. And that's, like, at least to me, extremely striking, because when you know that French universities are, for the most part, free, while US universities are very far from being free. So perhaps a bit of, obviously, it's, you know, I'm not going to claim any causation here, but maybe part of the explanation for the very low social mobility comes from this big social gradient in access to higher education. So now I'm going to tell you, you're going to be thinking maybe it's not an academic seminar, it's more like a newspaper article. I'm going to tell you two big cliches about the French population, which are actually backed by the data. So it seems that French people are aware that work does not pay in France. And when you look at the World Value Survey, French people are very unlikely to believe that hard work brings success. And actually, we are the country with the 5th lowest score on that question after Poland, Rwanda, Russia, and Serbia. And this, obviously, here I'm conjecturing, but this could explain France's very famous protest culture. So I was thinking maybe that's a cliche that the French people protest much more than everyone else. Actually, it's backed as well by the data in the World Value Survey. We are the country where the share of the population that has participated in a demonstration is the largest. And what we see oftentimes are violent riots where you have young people that confront the police in les banlieues, the suburbs of large French cities, where we know we have very low unemployment, very high unemployment rate for young people and low economic opportunities. And that leads us to the context of where this intervention emerged. So in 2005, when they were trying to escape the police, 2 young people died in dramatic circumstances, and that led to the very violent riots in the fall of 2005. Sociological studies have documented that, of course, not all, but many rioters had, well, they were for the most part French, but they had an immigrant background with family origins in northern and sub-Saharan Africa. And that led the French political class to view these events as a failure of the French integration model. And so there's been a number of policy responses. So after he got elected, Nicolas Sarkozy tasked Fadela Amara, who was the Secretary of State for Urban Policies, to design what has been called the Espoir Banlieue plan, which was formally announced by Sarkozy in a speech in 2008. So it's an interesting speech. I did not have enough space to put some quotes, but the speech has numerous references to integration, diversity, etc. So it's essentially a call to end ethnic discriminations in France and to improve the opportunities for a specific subset of the immigrant population, those that are responsible. And it's here I'm quoting, like those who work hard in school, etc., etc. And so one of the concrete announcements was the creation of this Internet Excellence program that we're going to be studying. So those are boarding schools for middle and high school students. So importantly, despite the Sarkozy speech, we're still in the patrie des droits de l'homme with the l'universalisme républicain. So you cannot, in France, legally explicitly target students based on their ethnicity and their country of origin. That would be illegal. And so instead, in the official decrees that started the program, the target population were deserving students from quartiers politiques de la ville, which are priority neighborhoods in France. Okay. So I'm going to describe the treatment in a bit more detail, but essentially that's giving better studies. So it's a boarding school. That's the first main thing. But then the school also has better studying conditions than a regular public school. For instance, class size is a bit smaller. The teachers, at least from what students say, seem to be more motivated than in a regular public school. And what's, so again, France being the patrie des droits de l'homme, affirmative action policies are extremely rare in France. And that's a very unusual, intensive compensatory intervention for the French context, because here we are literally doubling in these schools, we are doubling the expenditure per student relative to what students would have in a regular public school. So in the first paper we wrote with Marc and Luc on that paper, we looked at short-term effects of this program. We used the fact that we had a lottery that we had more applicants than seats, and so a lottery determined who got in, who did not. And so we studied one such boarding school, Sourdun, which is the first to open, which is kind of the flagship of the program. And we looked at short-run effects. So we looked at effects 1 and 2 years after the lottery. And we found positive but fairly modest effects. So first, after one year after admission, no effect at all. In fact, negative effects. We found that the treatment group students had lower well-being levels than the control group students, perhaps not super surprising. Send them to a boarding school, you cut them from their friends and families, so it's not completely unsurprising that their well-being would be affected. And then after 2 years, well-being levels had caught up, so no longer any negative effect, and we started seeing positive cognitive effects of the order of 28% of the standard deviation increase in math test scores per year spent in the school, which is a sizable effect, but in view of the very high cost of the program, it's not necessarily such a high effect. So in this paper, what we're going to be talking about is what are the long-run effects of this, does the program have long-run effects? Do we see that it makes students more likely to complete their secondary schooling and to complete some higher education? And if that's the case, who are the students who benefit the most? So first, I'm going to give you some detail on our study population, the study design, and the data we use. So the study population, in terms of academic ability, the applicants to this Internet Excellence are good students, very good students, in fact, relative to their classmates. So they score like 40% of the standard deviation above the average of their classmates from the public schools they're coming from. But because those schools are in more disenfranchised areas, those schools are themselves below the French average. So when you compare them to the national distribution, they are actually kind of median students. They indeed come from relatively modest families. So 50% of students have parents that are blue-collar employee or unemployed. They are very likely to benefit from means-tested grants. And importantly for our analysis, it seems that this implicit targeting on students coming from minority backgrounds was indeed implemented in the sense that we cannot directly measure that. The proxy we use to measure whether someone is presumably from an immigrant background is whether French is the only language spoken at home, and we find that for only 40% of our population, that's the case. Of course, it's an imperfect proxy, and there's going to be errors in both directions. But that means that for 60% of our population, French is not the only language spoken at home. And we actually have the exact same question in a survey, in a representative survey of the French population. And there, so Mark, actually, I did not have that number on top of my head. I think I remember it's 10% in the national population, but is that correct? No. It's much more. So 60% is much of students for which French is not the only language spoken at home is much more than in the national population. Okay, so the treatment. So that's the treatment, and that's so it's literally a former military building close to Provins. but not actually within Provins. It's actually like in a very rural setup next to Provins. Provins is southeast. Yes.
Just want to better understand the treatment, I don't remember exactly. So if you take like a grade, compared to their grade, it's how many students who are going to be picked up in each school about? Like it's the top students, if I remember well, as you said. But
so it's very few actually. So and that's something that made our life very complicated when we did the short-term study, and we were not relying on admin data. We were doing our own surveys. What made it very hard is that if students had been originally coming from a very small number of schools, data collection would have been easy. But effectively, it's almost like there was each student was coming from a unique school. I'm exaggerating a little bit because there are a few instances where you had two students coming from the same school applying to the boarding school, but they were there was like it was the first Internet Excellence. It was supposed to cover the entire Créteil Academy, which is a very big academy. And every student from the Créteil Academy was eligible, even those, so due to the location of the boarding school, everyone lives far from that school. So the school had to provide, and that's what made the program costly, transportation to bring back students to their home during the weekend. So there was not any geographical constraint. Anyone from the Créteil Academy could apply, and so so students were coming from a large number of schools. I guess you're perhaps thinking of like general equilibrium effects. Does the fact that we take out those good students from their original schools negatively affect the?
Well, yeah, but you're also trying to understand. So because you tell us how they compare to their class, but because we know there's such a strong segregation within school, how do they compare to their grade? Is it that it's the best students from the best class, or it's different?
That's not something we've done. It's a good question actually. We've not looked at that. Whether they tend to be in the class where everybody is taking Latin, and therefore perhaps actually, No, but yeah, I know what you mean. No, we've not looked at that. That's a good question actually. And I think there was another question. No. Oh, okay. So a bit of a description of the treatment. So class size is a bit smaller, not tremendously smaller, 20 students versus 26 for students in the control group. Teachers are more qualified, more likely to have the aggregation degree, but less experienced. We asked students to declaratively to answer questions like, there is often noise and disruption in my classroom, etc. And from that, we construct a disruption index. And we see that the level of classroom disruption is much, much lower in the treatment than in the control group, which is not very surprising. You take those good, motivated students out of relatively difficult schools, so probably the classroom climate is going to be less disruptive. The teachers also seem to be much more involved. We don't really know why. Is it selection? Is it treatment effect? Because they find it easier to teach in that school. We can, of course, not speak to that. But it is the case that when we ask students whether they think that teachers care about themselves, are motivated, etc., students in the treatment group are much more likely to agree with this type of statements. And there, actually, when we construct an index, the difference is huge. Like in the treatment group, students are the index is 1.3 standard deviation larger than in the control group. Okay, so the design. So we conducted 2 lotteries for the first 2 cohorts admitted to that school in 2009 and 2010. We used the waitlist randomization. So the lottery was stratified at the gender and grade level. And within each cell that had more applicants than seats, we randomly ordered applicants. And if there was, let's say, a wait list with 10 applicants and 5 seats, we would offer the 5 seats to the first 5 people in the wait list. And then some people ended up changing their mind. You know, it's a big decision to move to a boarding school. They applied, but then when they get the offer, they actually change their mind, so they decline the offer. And then we go down the wait list until we have filled all of the available seats in for that group. So our study population are going to be the 395 students that participated in a lottery. 258 got an offer, 137 did not. So they are going to be our control group. We show in the first paper that randomization, you know, it's always a rhetorical exercise, but yes, randomization worked and the groups are balanced. And all the effects I'm going to show now are going to be intention to treat effects. I'm just going to compare students that got an offer to students that did not get an offer. A number that's important to keep in mind to interpret those ITT effects is the size of the first stage. So on average, students that receive an offer are going to spend 2.07 years more in Sourdun than students that do not get an offer. And so to understand that first stage, up to a very small number of exceptions, students that did not get an offer did not go to the boarding school. So we almost have a treatment of 0 in the control group. Now in the treatment group, that's where we have a lot of, that's where compliance is extremely heterogeneous, because you have the students that just decline the offer when they receive it, and that's like 15% of the treatment group. Then you have the students that come but stay, you know, a month. That's a very small minority. What's much more common is the students that come to the school, stay a year, and then do not re-enroll. And then you have the students that do like potentially all of their middle and high school in the boarding school.
It was completely free, right?
Yes, it's completely free. Except, no, I think even the canteen is free, actually, which is, so it's even more free than a public school.
Actually, that's something that I was thinking about. So you compare Sourdun to their original schools, which I think makes a lot of sense. I think it would be also super interesting to compare Sourdun to other schools, which are not these crappy schools, right? To see whether is it a boarding effect, really, or is it that, because you say there's much less disruption, but there's also much less disruption in any other schools if you don't restrict the schools.
Yeah. What could be interesting, so the thing is, we're going to be much more limited in terms of the variables we observe, sure, like the disruption things we want, but we could compare, let's say, to, you know, like Catholic private schools, for instance.
I think now in the data you have encouragement and all that, and you may have, you know, avertissement or stuff like that now.
Okay.
Maybe.
Yeah, and what we could, yeah. No, that would be that would definitely be interesting. Yeah. Okay, so the data so that's an example where we're lucky that we can rely on admin data, which just means we have to wait for a long time. So we use 2 data sources. We use the CISCA data sets to track students throughout their secondary schooling. And we use the CS data to track them throughout their higher education. And actually, those numbers are not updated. I forgot to update that. But now we have, I think CISCA we go all the way to 2019, and CS we go all the way to 2020. So that we can almost consider that there is no censoring anymore. That, you know, if someone, according to our measure, has not graduated from secondary schooling, the only circumstance in which that person would in reality have graduated from secondary school is if they would have repeated 5 times during their 5 grades during their secondary schooling, which is very unlikely. So now, and same thing for higher education. So at this point, we've waited long enough that we can consider that we measure the outcomes. And so we're going to only look at one outcome, which is the highest degree obtained, be it in high school or HS or higher education, HE. And so that's what I'm going to show now. So the First, we're going to look at a fairly coarse family of outcomes, which is whether someone leaves high school without any degree, or gets a technical or vocational high school degree, or gets a non-vocational high school degree. So this is bac général, and this is bac technologique, or bac professionnel, or CAP, BEP, or gets some higher education degree. Okay. And then we're going to look at a bit finer outcomes by disaggregating the higher education degrees that someone can get by looking at technical or vocational higher education, so BTS, UT. Then we're going to look at universities, which in France are non-selective. And we know that the labor market returns of universities in France heavily depend on your field of study. So essentially, we are going to divide field of studies into quote-unquote high-paying fields. So science, technology, and math, and economics and law. So that's why we have STEML instead of STEM. And then we're going to look at people who graduate from university in any other discipline than those ones here. And then we're going to look at people who graduate from a selective grande école, because France has this two-tier higher education system where you have the non-selective universities and you have the selective grande école, but the labor market returns of selective grande école are much larger, typically, not always, but on average, than those of universities. And then we also have non-selective grande école, and finally, we have the other category. And finally, the last exercise we do is, so we take enquête emploi, so the French CPS, and we take many waves of it, and we look at individuals between 30 and 35 years old to get a reliable measure of wages, not the wage when you just entered the labor market. And for each of those categories, which we can map fairly well into the enquête emploi, we compute the average wage. And then we can we use that to predict. We essentially predict the wage that someone will obtain based on the highest degree they completed. So of course, we've not waited long enough to actually get the wages. But and we will wait long enough to get the wages. But we think that wages predicted based on the highest degree you completed are already fairly reliable, and that we can already get a sense of what are the wage returns we could expect from this intervention. Okay, so now to the result. Yes. Sorry.
So you will be able to get administrative data for the wages, or you have to service?
Yes. So yes. So now actually, France already has in law, but in practice not quite yet, the equivalent of the Scandinavian registry data, except that you don't have health. But now you're going to be able to track people with all of their educational and labor market outcomes from CP to the labor market.
Because one thing that's super interesting is that there could be discrimination on the labor market, so you may be overestimating predicted wages.
No,
in practice, getting a high education degree doesn't help you that much if you're from another.
Yeah, no, definitely. That would be exactly. So in that sense, very good point. It could go, you could also say perhaps in terms of they also get non-cognitive skills at the boarding school that are not reflected in their degree, so the wage return could be even larger than that. No, I agree. Like there are many, but I agree.
Because in enquête emploi, you don't know people's origin, right? So you can't look at
very good point.
You can't look at returns to education by
very good point.
for example.
So we certainly don't know their ethnic origin, that's for sure. But do we have a proxy similar to the one we are using? Perhaps actually, and that would be super interesting. I don't know. Like I would need to check. No, you don't. Nationality?
Maybe place of birth.
So most of them are French, so that would.
I mean, nationality would not work, but if we have place of birth, that's except that it's not completely the same thing because most likely most of those kids are born in France but so it's not exactly the same, but could go in the Yes, Nina?
About that, so two things maybe about that. The enquête Theo from UNED might be useful, but I don't know if they have the wages in there. And second thing is, it would be super nice to do the same exercise as what you did with employment, right? Because this is supposing that they're going to be employed, or this is taking into account.
Okay, very good point. So for now, so we could do also the exercise that you're doing, but for now, so we've been talking among ourselves about that. For now, we are actually dropping the zeros, so people who are unemployed. So because, which perhaps is not the, I mean, you know, there are pros and cons, but we're going to redo this exercise, putting zeros to people who are unemployed to really get at a measure of labor income. And that's going to increase a little bit that effect, right, mechanically, because being more educated also reduces the chances that you are unemployed. But I agree with you that a third exercise could also be to do the predicted effect for the unemployment rate. And I think that would be quite interesting.
It's a monthly wage, huh?
It's a monthly wage, yes, absolutely. Yeah, it's a monthly wage. Okay, so yes.
So your effect on dropout is huge, right? So it goes from like 27% to 14%. I think I get about similar stuff in my project, looking at what happens when they go out of these terrible schools. But I think it would be nice also to compare that to what's the probability of dropping out in any other school, right, which is not located in Quebec. To see whether.
So do you close the gap between? Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, no, I agree. That would be. So we did the bit of that, but yeah. So in different. So what we did is, for instance, we looked at. We compared the probability of obtaining bac général in the control group and in the French population, and it was below, despite the fact that initially those students were at the median, so they were comparable to the average student. And then the treatment more than closes the gap. Actually, in the treatment group, they are more likely, and the more selective the outcome, the more they start being above the French average. Like, for instance, the share of them who obtain bac général from the science track starts being really much higher than in the French population, and the enrollment rate in higher. So here, actually, yeah. So that's the issue with looking at with constructing the outcome this way as the highest degree obtained, because for that outcome, I don't know the number in the French population. But what I remember is that, again, for an outcome which was enrolling into higher education, same thing. They were below the French average in the control, but then they get above with the treatment. Yes.
Just to be clear, this is just the difference between the two groups, or is it the result of a regression?
So this is, yes, that's the result of a regression where we have a few control variables. We control for baseline math and French score. We control for, we have 6 control variables, and those control variables we kept, so the results are robust to dropping the controls. And the controls, we did not do any sophisticated lasso or anything. We just kept the same control that we had used in the previous paper. So in some sense, it's just to be consistent with the previous paper. So yeah, so it's a bit misleading to say this is a T minus C. This is a beta hat, not a T minus C.
Sorry.
Yes.
And so there, when you had zeros, you remove the zeros
for the predicted wage,
yeah,
but not in the. So yeah, we are not dropping anyone. We have 395 observations. It's in the enquête emploi when we construct a predicted wage for each of those degrees. There we drop the people who are unemployed. Okay, so I guess I actually don't have to comment on the results because it seems that everybody has understood them. But yeah, we find very large results, a dropout rate that's that's divided by almost 2. A much higher proportion of people who complete some higher education. And in the full sample, that's mostly coming from people who enroll in universities in a STEML field. And we see a bit of a positive effect on the proportion of people who graduate from a grande école, but it's not significant. And we see an effect on predicted wages, which is, in relative terms, it's about 8%. 8% increase in predicted monthly wage.
I'm sorry, I missed it and I don't remember. At what age do they go there?
So it's middle and high school. So they can enter, so our 395 students, it's about half and half. You have a half of them entered during their middle school, the other half entered in their high school. And middle school, any grade. So we have few students, it's a minority of students who enter in 6e or 5e, but we have the biggest entry points are 4e, 3e, and 2nd. So the last 2 grades of middle school and the first grade of high school.
And did you stratify so that you can look by grade, or?
So we did that. I'm not going to show that today. The results are not strikingly different depending. So we did not do it by grade because we have 395. If we divide by 7, that starts being very noisy. What we did is middle versus high school that we did, and we did not find hugely different results.
So for those who arrive in 4e, it means that if they stay on average 2 years, it means that for high school, they're just going. So it would be nice to see what type of high school then they're going to go to. I guess it might be affected.
Yeah, no, that's a good. Yeah, it's a very good point. Actually, I think we can. I mean, it's a bit tricky to because there is selection, of course, in terms of who leaves. But we could do something like how the characteristics of your high school evolve over time.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a bit tricky because you will always have some students that remain in this school. So you will never have a point in time where everybody has left the school, so that if you see a difference in terms of, but
you can compare average characteristic of high school.
Yeah, no, I agree. That would be to see if when they leave their school, yeah, because okay. So I think the thing on which you could actually have a nice statistical test is if you see that the characteristics of the high school, or rather the gap between the treated and control group high school characteristics is stable over time, despite the fact that some of them leave this school, then that would mean that they leave, but they go to schools that resemble actually the. So yeah, it's a very nice idea. We should do something like that. Thank you.
Another question. Very basic.
Yes.
So you said that if you do it by college high school, it's not very different, but the first stage is different.
The first stage is different, but less than you would expect actually. So it's if I'm.
Part of the explanation.
So exactly. So in line with. This first stage here is lower than the theoretical first stage you could have expected, taking into account the fact that they enter, not so. If they all entered in 6e, the first grade in middle school, the theoretical first stage would be 7 years, much lower than that. Of course, they don't enter all of them in 6e; they enter at later points in time. But the maximum amount of time they could have spent in the school, if I'm remembering correctly, it's around 4 years. So they stay for half of this theoretical first stage, and you see that few of the students who enter in 6e, very few of them take the baccalaureate exam while still being in the boarding school, and that's why. Even the high school graduation effects can already be thought of as long-run effects, and not like effects when you're still directly exposed to the treatment.
So, sorry.
Yes.
Do you know if I understood correctly? Most of them leave if they join when they are in 6e. Most of them will leave before they go to baccalaureate.
Yes.
Is this their decision, or is it because they have to leave and they cannot stay?
So that we don't really know. The anecdotal evidence that I have is that the students who leave, many of the students who leave during their first year in the boarding school, that's not their decision. They're actually being expelled out of the school, you know, because of like disruptive behavior problem, that type of things. I would, but again, you know, that's just my feeling about knowing how the program works. I would be very surprised that the school asks a student who has been there for 2 years to leave. Like, to me, it's much more likely that it is the student's own decision to leave at that point.
So why most of them leave?
So I don't really know, but perhaps. Okay, so then we look at heterogeneous effects among the majority and the minority students, with the idea that because, at least implicitly, the minority students were those that were targeted by the policy, it's interesting to look at the effect in that subgroup. And we actually find larger effects in the group of minority students. So, for instance, the probability of obtaining some higher education degree increases by 11.7 percentage points for the majority students, and by 18.4 percentage points for the majority students. When we look at the proportion of students who graduate from a selective grande école, so what's interesting is that in the control group, among minority students, it's 0 actually. None of them graduate from a grande école, and that proportion raises to almost 8 percentage points, which I guess, again, I will need to check, but I'm pretty sure it's way above the French average, actually. I mean, it's going to depend on the exact definition we've used for selective grande école, but I think we've used a relatively strict definition. So yeah, I'm pretty confident this is more than the French average. Interestingly, for the...
About that, it would be nice to see whether they end up in a high school where there is a debate more often.
Yes. Yeah, that's definitely an outcome because there is one in the boarding school. Okay. But we could then construct this, and that would be an indicator of the school quality, and we could see how this is evolving, like the treatment effect on whether your high school has high school or not, prep or not, how this is evolving over time. And if this is stable, then that means that they leave the boarding school because they don't like the military aspect of it, but they go to a similar school in terms of, yeah, so I think that's definitely something we should look at. Okay, and then when we look at the effect on predicted wages, the effect is actually almost 3 times larger for the minority students. For those, actually, the wage return is a bit above 10%. It's 10.5 percentage points.
Do you have effects by gender?
Yes, we do have them. We don't find any very large differences. So we do find differences, not on those items here. When we look at the effect on the high school degree obtained, we see that for both genders, the increase in the percentage of students that get a bac général is the same, but the counterfactuals are very different. The girls that, thanks to the program, get the bac général would have dropped out, while the boys who, thanks to the program, get the bac général would have gotten a technical or vocational bac, which, you know, is a bit what you would what you could perhaps have expected.
And the take-up rate is the same?
The take-up rate, yes, the first stage is, if I remember, I mean, yeah, it's not like vastly different.
In terms of mechanism, do you see any particularly strong effect on French? Is it that because they interact a lot with French people, then they get better at French, and that's useful for you don't?
You mean in terms of cognitive outcomes?
Yeah, in terms of test scores at brevet or anything you have that is extremely great.
So actually, we don't find any effect on French test scores. We only find effect on math test scores. And that's actually what I'm going to, now we're gonna, so that's an heterogeneity that we found interesting and that we figured out in the long-run effects paper. And so we went back and we were like, perhaps we have missed that heterogeneity in the short-run papers. And indeed, what I'm going to show you now is that we have completely missed that heterogeneity. It was already there, we had just not seen it.
Why are you estimating separate regressions rather than interactions?
We could, but it's, I mean, it's equivalent, no? Like the only benefit.
I hope it is.
Hmm?
I hope it is.
Yeah, no, it is. So I can confirm it is. You just don't get the t-test, but no, you can do it.
So you're also interacting all the controls with this.
Yeah, no, but that's essentially, yeah, you can either interact everything or run two separate regressions. We went for the second one, and then we compute the t-stats by hand, but it's not very complicated because those are disjoint populations, so you don't have any covariance. Okay, so first, some descriptive statistics to try to because as you can guess, I mean, you know, like all your comments seem to suggest that there are many ways we could pitch this paper other than the one we are going to pitch it. And so we are thinking of pitching it along the minority-majority difference. And so first we want to compare a bit the two populations. We compare them at baseline, and we see that the minority students, they come from poorer families. Then we compare them in terms of academic outcomes. The minority students are stronger at baseline. When we look at their grade in math at baseline, they score 32% of standard deviation higher than the majority students. It's not the case in French. While at the same time, they come from worse schools, because when we look at their peers' grade, their peers are, it seems, weaker than the peers of the majority students. Of course, as we know, those are grades given by schools. Those are not standardized scores. So there could be potentially school fixed effects in grading. But we're gonna find similar differences when we compare the two populations on our own standardized test scores. Yes.
So just that, I'm not sure I understand like which sample exactly you're using. You're using the control group sample, I guess.
No. Here, sorry, I'm using everyone, but I'm looking at baseline characteristics. Okay.
And so does that mean that you have to be much stronger in math in order to get into Sourdun compared to
when you're
minority?
So that could be an interpretation based on my understanding of, that could be an interpretation actually. I mean, I have nothing to rule it out. My understanding is more about differential selection of the minority and the majority students into the pool of applicants. How could we test whether there's been, we could actually,
pool of applicants before selection?
Yeah, because they did actually, they did not accept to do unconditional randomization. They did not have 395. They had, I think, 500 and something applicants. They discarded some of them that they thought were, not eligible for the program. And looking at that margin, we could indeed test if they rejected. I would be very surprised if that were the case, but who knows?
And so the two bottom rows then shows that there's like huge discrimination against minority, right? Because even if they're even better in math, they're much worse in terms of grades, right?
Okay, so here I'm looking at their peers. I'm looking at moyenne de classe.
Peers grades.
Yeah. Okay. I'm looking at the.
Their own grade. That would be interesting.
So I have their own grade here. That's their own grade, which is.
Oh, that's the grade given by teachers?
By teachers, yeah.
Oh, and you have a test score?
Yeah, we do have test scores. It's just that the test scores, we can only look at the control group, so we no longer can do the minority-majority comparison in, it's already a very small population, but we do it. We find similar order of magnitude, but the differences are less significant. But you're gonna be able to actually see them when I show some of the later tables.
Can you just go back? So the control group, go back to the heterogeneity treatment effects.
Yes. That's one.
Okay, so among the minority, the control group actually does better than the control group in. So that's consistent with them doing better to start with.
Yes, exactly. So it depends. So what we're going to see is that in terms of outcomes, in the control group, the minority do much better for all the high school outcomes, but they don't. But as soon as higher education starts, actually they don't do better anymore. So that's a bit also an interpretation. Okay, so we also compare them in terms of non-cognitive outcomes. In terms of their behavior grade, in French school, students get a behavior grade, and they seem to be better behaved than the minority students. Interestingly, we also look at motivation for schooling and ambition. And so very small sample, okay, because that's one of the, here I'm looking at one of our own outcomes, so I have to get rid of the treatment group, and you know, we have attrition also for that outcome, but we had a parental questionnaire where we asked parents what is their level of ambition for their children in terms of whether they want them to complete some higher education. And we had several questions, so we did a standardized score. And that score is 53% of the standard deviation higher among the minority parents. And that's the parents. The students themselves, they don't seem to have more motivations for schooling or more ambition, etc. But the parents seem to have much more ambition.
How do you interpret your standardized score? For example, if I look at motivation for schooling among the majority, what does it mean minus 0 to?
So it means that with respect to the mean of that score, the majority are 30% below. 30%. Yeah.
The difference in minority, so it's centered around who is at.
So I think that's.
For the minority, it's also negative.
Yes, so I think it's probably, and that's not the best practice, it's probably standardized with respect to the full population, including the treated. And because we have a positive effect, positive treatment effect, the entirety of the control group is below the average. Okay, but it's not like the better practice is to actually. Yeah, I mean, I'm not 100% sure, but that's the only way I can make sense of this of those two numbers.
So this variable parents' ambition for higher education, I guess that might be like thinking about the makeup, right? Who's taking S and who's not. That might be also a big predictor of who's taking S.
Parents' ambition in terms of higher education, of who is taking up Sourdun or who is going into higher education? Yes, yeah, probably. Like that could be, yeah.
Actually, what the literature, what we found on that is like it seems that first generation immigrants are much more ambitious than second generation immigrants, right? And that has been found.
No, exactly. And this has been found, like, you know, it's not only our specific population, it's been found nationwide. Actually, there are studies showing that, that especially when you control for scores, then immigrants have actually much more ambition. Okay, and related to Pascaline's question, so that's where we see what. So here we're looking at the progression from high school to higher education, but in the control group and comparing the majority and the minority students. And so you see that in high school, the minority do much better. They're much less likely to leave without any degree. And they're much more likely to get a bac général, and they are even, like, when you look at this difference, this is really large. Like, only 16% of the majority students get a bac général sciences track, and that proportion raises to 35% in the control group. And yet, their outcomes in terms of higher education are not terribly better. They are a bit more likely to enroll in some higher education, but it's mostly because they enroll in BTS or UT degrees. They are actually a bit less likely to enroll in university or to enroll in a class prepa. And so here, I'm going to go quickly on that, but we redid all of our first paper along the minority-majority dimension. And what we find is quite interesting. So we find that, for instance, so we had said that students in the treatment group are much more likely to say that their teachers care about themselves, that they have good relationship with their teachers. that effect is actually much larger for the minority than for the majority students. It's almost 3 times larger. Okay, and same thing for the quality of their relationship with their teachers. When we look at the effect of the boarding school on academic outcomes, first, in terms of how hours per week the students spend doing their homework, there is barely any effect on the majority students. And that's very surprising because in the boarding school, they actually have dedicated study time hours in the end of each day. So it means that despite of that, they don't spend more time doing their homework, while for the majority students, you see a very large positive effect.
This is per week or per day?
Per week, per week. Yeah. So yeah, French students are really yeah, after a very long school day already, they still and then we had this effect on math boards that after 2 years, that actually entirely comes from the minority students. On the majority students, even after 2 years in the boarding school, there is no effect on their ability.
Excuse me.
Yes?
The homework hours are included in the dedicated time or hour? Yeah,
so
they are in the they are in boarding school.
So we ask both questions. How many hours a day do you spend in study time, supervised study time? But that's kind of mechanical that there's going to be an effect because that's not something that always exists in regular public school. What's more interesting is how much time they spend doing their homework.
One interpretation is that parents, like Sourdun, substitutes parents for the French equivalent.
Yes, and then the majority, their parents are going to be behind their back anyways. Yeah, but you know, so the levels in the controls are not super different a bit, but you know, that's not accounting for the entirety. It's not like they're just catching up with the majority in Sourdun. Plus, you know, like this makes me think that those minority parents might actually be behind the back of their. So yeah.
No, but so for 2, they spend. Is it the take-up is the same? Like
the take-up is a bit smaller among the majority students, but it's not like tremendous. Yeah.
Because if we look at the homework stuff, then the majority students spend 2 hours less doing homework than the other guys. But if you're in a boarding school, military type boarding school, it's very hard to imagine that there could be these differences in actually time spent. You see what I mean?
Yes.
It's like a pretty homogeneous treatment in principle. So it would be nice to see how much this comes from different take-up rate of
yes. Yeah.
This is during the week?
This is during the week, so they could be catching up during the weekend. So we also have it disaggregated, and you know, we ask on Monday and on Saturday. But that's a bit of the story, but that's not the entirety of the story. Even on Monday, they say I've spent more. Those say that they spend. So it could be then that. Again, it's always a bit tricky because you know who lives, who stays is endogenous. But yeah, we could see if because it's true that there is a bit of a differential take-up between the two.
And if you go home on the weekend systematically?
Systematically, yeah, systematically, yeah. Unless you know exceptional circumstances, they have to go home. Okay, and then we look at non-cognitive outcomes, and we see large and very positive effects for the minority students on academic self-esteem, social self-esteem, general self-esteem, intrinsic motivation, and A motivation. While for the majority students, there is not much going on, so there is this effect that's positive and significant, but motivation is the opposite of, it's like, I don't want to do anything, and you know, whether you agree with, I want to stay in my room and not talk to people, and that's this type of, I don't want to go to school. And so being less unmotivated is good. That's the, I mean,
it's a real world, or word?
It's a real world. I mean, no, it's a real world. Yeah. We took, you know, this psychometric scale there,
This last part is very interesting because I think, Jan, in your paper, you in the growth mindset paper, you find no effect on the poor kids, right? So that's here, there is a strong effect on the poor kids. And it seems that might be coming from the teachers' side, right? To say that they're very happy with how the teachers deal with them and stuff, right?
Yeah, no, exactly. It seems that there is really like, and of course, we are not going to be able to really say what, but yeah, there is something that's really working for them there, and not so much for the majority students.
It's related. I had an additional question about the definition of your non-cognitive skills in terms of self-esteem or motivation. But do you look at really outcomes like growth mindset, fatality, locus of control, things that may capture much more this issue of effort or that you are boosting in your program?
Because we started too early, like at this time.
Before this, like the rise in literature.
Yeah, exactly. Like this, like we did our surveys, like this was like 2009, 10. So that's the time when economists started realizing that not only measuring test scores was important, but what we were measuring at that point was still pretty rough. I mean, I think based on the names, I guess you probably know actually the very scale that we are using is like this. Yeah. Yes.
Why is, for example, academic self-esteem negative on the control group for both groups? What is it?
So that's again because of our weird standardization with respect to everyone rather than the control group.
Everyone.
No, sorry. Everyone, including the treated, and the treatment has a positive effect. Yes.
The result is just that when they enter the boarding schools, they are not more motivated. Like you could think of parents from minority groups that are maybe don't aren't themselves much educated, but are pushing a lot their kids. But here it doesn't seem.
It doesn't seem that they did not choose to go there. It was their parents who made the. So yeah, and consistent with that, when we look at, so we have a question whether it was the child, the parent, or the school of origin that had the idea of applying for the boarding school. And it's a bit, it's one third in both groups. Actually, it's not very different who got the idea in the first place. So
it could come with the selection that you showed before.
With which one? The
when they enter, like they are more better skilled.
Yeah, exactly. So they definitely are, but it does. Yeah. No, I mean it's true that actually. No, yeah. So the thing that's very different is actually the social self-esteem. That's the one that's very different, and actually the effects go in the opposite direction. And here, I mean, schematically, perhaps those kids are really much better than their peers. So in their schools of origin, so maybe they don't have they're a bit outliers in their schools of origin. So that's why they don't have that many friends. And then you put them with students who are much more similar to them, and they are able to make friends. While for those ones, so why we actually have a negative effect? It's a bit hard to rationalize, and it's not even significant. But that could explain why. Perhaps that could explain the difference at baseline.
But they also have pretty low academic self-esteem, right? The minority kids, even though they're doing very well.
Yes.
So it must be, as I was saying about the teachers in the school of origin, kind of discriminating, I guess. Them in a way that makes them feel like.
Yeah. No, that could be. Yeah, because it's true that there is really no risk here. And this gap, if we were to control for actual ability, perhaps would become much larger actually. So yeah. Okay, thank you very much.